cop arrests wrong black woman. He's shocked in court to learn she's the state's chief prosecutor. A sudden flash of red and blue lights, a tense exchange on a busy Chicago street, and a life-altering mistake. One police officer's fateful decision leads to a jaw-dropping confrontation inside a packed courtroom. When a dedicated cop arrests a black woman on suspicion of criminal behavior, he has no idea she's the most powerful prosecutor in the state. What follows is a tangled web of institutional bias, personal vendettas, and haunting secrets that threaten to unravel everything he thought he knew about justice. The shocking truth emerges under the unforgiving lights of the Cook County Courthouse, leaving everyone stunned by the final twist. Officer Richard "Rick" Devlin considered himself a man of unwavering principle. At 38, he had served with the Chicago Police Department for over 15 years. He was known around the district station on West 35th Street for his consistent track record, sharp instincts, a relentless work ethic, and a certain rigidity that could be interpreted as either strong moral fiber or unyielding stubbornness, depending on who you asked. The day everything began felt entirely routine to Rick. He woke to the buzz of his alarm at 5:30 in the morning. After performing a quick set of push-ups and crunches, he prided himself on staying in decent shape. He went to the kitchen to brew his usual coffee. Black, no sugar. Gazing out the window of his modest apartment in Bridgeport, he took in the quiet dawn while reviewing the day's mental checklist. He had an 8-hour shift scheduled, plus a mandatory departmental meeting in the early afternoon regarding new community policing initiatives. On this particular morning, Rick felt neither restless nor especially alert. It was an ordinary start. The streets of Chicago were just beginning to stir, a few joggers here and there, city buses picking up early commuters. He drove his well-worn sedan through the neighborhood, mind drifting between random thoughts about his mother's health. She had been in and out of hospitals with chronic issues and the overdue repairs his landlord promised to handle. Little did Rick know that the next 12 hours would send a wrecking ball through the tidy walls of his life. Fate, or chance, or some cosmic alignment would place him on a direct collision course with the city's newly appointed state's chief prosecutor, Dr. Imani Caldwell. Although the title chief prosecutor often connotes an entire team of attorneys, Dr. Caldwell was unique. She had fought her way up through the ranks of the Cook County State's Attorney's Office and earned a national reputation for her unflinching stance on police misconduct, civil rights, and institutional accountability. An imposing figure in the legal world, she'd recently been tapped by the governor himself to serve as a special statewide chief prosecutor focused on criminal justice reform, a first-of-its-kind role in Illinois. Yet on this unremarkable morning, Dr. Caldwell was simply Imani, a warm-hearted woman who had dedicated her life to justice. She had woken early in her Hyde Park condominium, drank her own version of a morning brew ginger tea with honey, and set out to review a stack of case files that demanded her attention. She was finalizing arguments in a high-profile civil rights case involving allegations of wrongful policing tactics in one of Chicago's marginalized communities. Though she had plenty of staff to assist her, Imani believed in a hands-on approach, often doing significant portions of the legal heavy lifting herself. She didn't plan to visit the precinct that morning. She had back-to-back meetings at the Daily Center downtown. But a last-minute call from her cousin changed her route. A family friend had gotten caught up in a bureaucratic tangle over a property dispute, and Imani decided to personally track down some records at the Cook County building. Knowing how easily the day could slip away, she left her condo early, dressed in a simple navy blue pantsuit, and carried a heavy black leather briefcase brimming with documents. Destiny, or unfortunate coincidence, placed Officer Devlin and Dr. Caldwell in the same quadrant of the city at the same pivotal moment. Soon their worlds would collide in a way that neither anticipated, setting into motion a chain of events that would shake the Chicago legal system, draw media attention from all corners of the country, and force a reckoning in Officer Devlin's personal life. Their first meeting would be anything but cordial. Rick was driving his patrol car along 47th Street, an area that had seen its share of crime in recent years. He was partnered with Officer Danielle Alvarez, a rookie who had only been on the force for 6 months. Officer Alvarez had grown up in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood on the West Side and had joined the department with high hopes of improving community relations. She had a friendly demeanor, a genuine smile, and an eagerness that sometimes worried Rick. He saw potential in her, but also recognized the naivete that came with inexperience. As they were patrolling, dispatch crackled over the radio, a 911 call reporting suspicious activity in front of a liquor store on 47th and Prairie. Alvarez turned the wheel swiftly, lights flashing but no sirens, as they navigated the morning traffic. Rick's mind conjured up images of possible scenarios: loitering, maybe a drug deal. The 47th Street corridor was known to have pockets of gang influence, but it was also a zone where the city had tried to invigorate small businesses. Usually, mornings were quieter, but one never knew. When they pulled up to the liquor store, everything seemed calm, at least from first glance. The store's neon signs flickered. A few people were strolling by, and across the street was a cafe setting out tables for its early customers. The clerk inside the liquor store waved them over, pointing to a tall man dressed in a black hoodie and a woman in business attire. According to the clerk, the man had been aggressively shouting at the woman, but the woman left swiftly, and the man followed. Rick and Alvarez got out of the cruiser. Almost immediately, they spotted the woman in question, a poised African-American woman, carrying a black leather briefcase, walking briskly away from the store down the block. The man in the hoodie was about 20 yards behind her, shouting incomprehensibly. Rick's adrenaline spiked. He had encountered similar domestic or potential harassment scenarios before. He signaled to Alvarez. They approached with caution. "M.A.A.M. Is everything all right?" Alvarez called out. The woman paused, turned halfway, then shook her head. Her face was partially shadowed by the morning light, but she maintained a calm, confident posture. "I'm fine. Just a stranger yelling nonsense," she responded. Rick's gaze shifted from the woman to the man. Something in Rick's experience told him the man might be high, or at least agitated. He was pacing back and forth, throwing up his arms, muttering curses under his breath. Rick advanced, cutting in front of the woman protectively. "Sir, step back," he ordered. The man sized him up, scowled, and retreated a step, still glaring at the woman. For a moment, Rick thought the immediate threat was neutralized. Imani Caldwell, in that moment, was more annoyed than afraid. She had encountered countless unruly individuals in her line of work, though usually in a courtroom or a detention facility. She appreciated the officers intervening, but felt their attention was better spent on the man yelling at her. However, she knew better than to ignore police instructions. Growing up as a black woman had taught her the importance of staying calm and collected in any interaction with law enforcement. "Ma'am, I need to see your identification," Rick said, turning his attention back to her. A small voice in the back of his mind reminded him of protocol. If this was a potential victim, typically the first step would be to separate the victim and suspect, gather statements, and ensure public safety. While Imani was used to being asked for ID, sometimes out of simple prejudice, other times in official capacities, she felt an instantaneous flash of irritation. Still, she kept her composure, retrieving her wallet from her purse. "Certainly, officer," she replied. The man behind them seemed to be calming down. Officer Alvarez gestured for him to move further away for questioning. Rick took the ID from the woman, glanced at it. The name was clearly printed, Imani Caldwell, with an address in Hyde Park, date of birth, and a small gold insignia signifying it was a special identification for officials in the state's attorney's office. He didn't read it carefully. Instead, he allowed his suspicion to flare. "Where were you two coming from?" Rick asked tersely. "Not we two, sir. I don't know him," Imani answered, adjusting her stance. "He followed me from the intersection near the liquor store. I was simply heading to the county building." Rick narrowed his eyes. Something about the situation felt off, the fancy suit, the expensive briefcase, the tone of impatience in her voice. In Rick's experience, people involved in illegal activities sometimes wore business attire as cover. He'd busted more than one so-called white-collar criminal around these parts. He made a snap judgment, fueled by half-remembered bulletins about female scam artists in the city. Alvarez finished speaking with the man, who insisted the woman had stolen something from him. A watch, or maybe a ring. His story changed mid-sentence. Alvarez glanced at Rick. She didn't entirely trust the man's statement, but Rick's expression told her he was prepared to believe it. Something in the cop's manner signaled a readiness to escalate, or at least to interpret the situation in the worst possible way. "Ma'am, do you have anything that belongs to this man?" Alvarez asked politely. Imani let out a short, exasperated sigh. "I do not. I've never met this person in my life," she insisted. She was running late and had no time for this nonsense. "Look, I can show you more credentials if that helps." As she reached into her briefcase to pull out an official badge, something she carried for identifying herself at law enforcement facilities, Rick's suspicion flared hot. Reflexively, he stepped forward, yanking her arm back. "Hands, where I can see them," he barked, ignoring her protests. "Officer, please. You're under suspicion of theft," Rick declared, voice trembling with aggression. "Put the briefcase on the ground." He handcuffed her in a swift, practiced motion. Even as Alvarez began to protest, Rick ignored the rookie's confusion. Imani, for her part, stared at him in disbelief. The man in the hoodie, sensing opportunity, began laughing hysterically, an eerie, triumphant cackle. "Hey, Rick," Alvarez started, wanting to interject that maybe they should confirm the suspect's identity and the man's credibility first. But Rick had already decided. His heart hammered in his chest as he read Imani her Miranda rights. For him, this was just another petty criminal, possibly working in tandem with the suspect behind them. Or so he convinced himself. Imani tried to remain level-headed as a wave of indignation roiled in her chest. She had never been so publicly humiliated, never so forcibly and wrongly detained. She opened her mouth to declare who she was, but Rick's hand pressed down on her shoulder, guiding her toward the patrol car. Her eyes darkened with anger, but she swallowed her protests. She knew better than to resist physically. As the cuffs pinched her wrists, she felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal by the very system she had dedicated her life to improving. Officer Alvarez watched the entire scene unfold, her face etched with uncertainty. Something about this didn't feel right. The ID the woman had presented looked official. Perhaps Alvarez should step in, but she hesitated. Rick was a seasoned officer, a man with more experience than she could hope to accumulate in years. She didn't want to undermine him publicly. So she hovered, uncertain, as Rick led the woman to the back seat of the cruiser. The man in the hoodie was taken aside, written up for causing a public disturbance, and eventually let go with a warning, an ironic twist that would reverberate painfully later. And with that, the wheels of fate were set in irreversible motion. The ride back to the district station was tense. Rick drove in terse silence, occasionally glancing at Imani in the rearview mirror. She sat upright, the dignity in her posture clashing with the humiliating metal cuffs around her wrists. She said little. Her mind churned with 1,000 thoughts, From the immediate question of how to get out of this debacle to the bigger question of how such misguided policing could still occur in the very city she fought to reform. Alvarez bit her lip, wrestling with doubts that gnawed at her conscience. She had noticed the insignia on the suspect's ID. She also knew the departmental procedure that if you see official or government identification, you're supposed to confirm it with dispatch or a relevant database. Why had Rick been so quick to ignore that procedure? But the more pressing concern, if this woman was truly innocent, what were they doing? Alvarez felt complicit by her silence. They arrived at the station, a grey stone building with the Chicago Police Department insignia emblazoned on the facade. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the metallic benches and desks. Rick ushered Imani toward the booking area, ignoring her attempts to speak. Another officer at the reception desk gave them a puzzled look. Rarely did you see a well-dressed individual in a pantsuit and heels being hauled in like a common criminal. Imani took a calm breath, deciding that now was the time to assert her position. She turned to Rick, her voice measured but firm. "Officer, before you proceed any further, I strongly advise you to double-check my identification. I am Dr. Imani Caldwell, the state's chief prosecutor for Illinois." Rick snorted, not breaking stride. "Yeah, and I'm the governor," he muttered dismissively. Alvarez's eyes darted from Rick to Imani, the color draining from her face. "I'm serious," Imani said, more forcefully this time. "Look up my name in the state directory. Call the state's attorney's office. Call the governor's office if you need to. But do it now." A hush seemed to spread through the station as those words hung in the air. Another sergeant, Sergeant Paul Mills, overheard the commotion and ambled over, crossing his muscular arms over his chest. "What's going on here?" he asked. Officer Alvarez, unable to contain herself any longer, spoke up. "Sergeant, the suspect claims to be Dr. Imani Caldwell, the new state's chief prosecutor." She presented an official ID, but Officer Devlin insisted. "Let me see the ID," Sergeant Mills said. Rick, bristling, handed it over begrudgingly, as if passing a contraband item. Mills examined the identification thoroughly, his eyes going wide at the official seal. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He had seen Dr. Caldwell on the local news just last week, talking about police accountability. Carefully, Mills turned to look at Imani. The tension thickened. "Ma'am," he began, speaking to Imani with sudden deference, "if this is genuine, I apologize for any inconvenience. But we need to verify." "Please do," Imani said, locking eyes with Rick. "This has gone on long enough." Sergeant Mills handed the ID to a desk officer, instructing him to call the state's attorney's office for immediate verification. Rick stood there, arms crossed, cheeks growing red. The other officers in the station began whispering among themselves, rumors flying. Alvarez felt queasy, imagining the headlines that might follow if they had truly brought in the state's top prosecutor on false charges. This was a fiasco in the making. Over the next 5 excruciating minutes, the desk officer placed a call to the Cook County State's Attorney's office. The conversation was hushed, but bits of it floated through the stillness of the station. "Yes, we have Dr. Caldwell here. Claims wrongful arrest. Verifying credentials." The officers pretended to busy themselves, but everyone's ears were tuned to that phone call. When the desk officer hung up, his face was pale. He turned to Sergeant Mills, nodding vigorously. "It's her, Sarge." The reaction was immediate and electrifying. Sergeant Mills stepped forward, removing the handcuffs from Imani with trembling speed. "Dr. Caldwell, I apologize on behalf of the Chicago Police Department." He sounded frightened, as though he expected the wrath of the entire justice system to fall upon him then and there. Imani massaged her wrists, feeling the sting where the cuffs had pinched. A part of her wanted to lash out, to read them the riot act. But she maintained her composure, her voice steady. "It's not just about apologies," she said. "I want a full explanation of why I was detained. I did nothing but walk down the street. I provided my ID, and your officer refused to verify it." Now all eyes turned to Rick, who stood rigid, glaring at the floor. He could feel the entire station's gaze bore into him. In the background, Alvarez exhaled shakily, as though she'd been holding her breath for an hour. "I made a judgment call," Rick muttered stubbornly, still not quite able to back down. The entire fiasco was a catastrophic blow to his pride and, he suspected, to his career. A few tense seconds passed, then Sergeant Mills spoke with forced diplomacy. "Dr. Caldwell, obviously there's been a misunderstanding here. Let's go to my office and we can sort this out properly." Imani nodded, her jaw set. "I need my briefcase and personal belongings returned immediately," she demanded, turning once more to Rick, "and I want every name of every officer involved in this." Rick didn't say a word, but inside, a slow dread was building. He knew he had crossed a line today, and somehow, in the pit of his stomach, he sensed this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would not end quickly. The interview in Sergeant Mills' office was tense. The office itself was cramped, a battered metal desk taking up much of the floor space, one window letting in dim light from the alley outside. Imani sat on one side of the desk, her posture immaculate, her eyes steeled with righteous anger. Rick stood to the side, arms folded, while Sergeant Mills perched behind the desk. Officer Alvarez had been instructed to wait outside, but she lingered near the door, straining to catch fragments of the conversation through the thin walls. "Officer Devlin," Sergeant Mills began, pinching the bridge of his nose, "please explain the sequence of events leading to Dr. Caldwell's detainment." Rick's jaw tightened. "We received a call about suspicious activity near the liquor store on 47th. The clerk pointed out a man and woman. The man accused her of taking his property, so we followed protocol to investigate. The suspect," he caught himself awkwardly, "Dr. Caldwell, that is, was uncooperative at first." "Uncooperative," Imani repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Because I told you I was a prosecutor, and you refused to look at my credentials? Because I politely asked you to verify my ID, that's uncooperative?" Rick's eyes flicked to Sergeant Mills before answering. She reached into her briefcase suddenly, he said, voice taut. "I had to ensure officer safety. I was trying to maintain control of the situation." Imani let out a long breath through her nose. "Officer safety," she echoed softly, her tone tinged with sarcasm. "I see. And in your professional judgment, do I look like I was threatening you with my stack of legal documents?" Mills cleared his throat, searching for a diplomatic approach. "Dr. Caldwell, we take every measure to ensure no one's safety is compromised. However, we absolutely recognize that verifying your ID immediately should have happened." He turned to Rick. "Officer Devlin, do you have anything else to add?" Rick hesitated. He wanted to argue, to stand by his instincts, but each second that passed felt like sinking deeper into quicksand. "I was following my gut," he finally said. "Maybe I was wrong in this case, but I was trying to do my job." "Your gut?" Imani repeated, her voice brimming with a quiet fury. "Your gut told you that a random man's baseless accusation was grounds to arrest me without proper verification. Your gut told you a well-dressed black woman with official ID must be a criminal rather than possibly the victim of harassment." Rick's face flushed. He had never been called out so directly on his assumptions. "That's not fair," he muttered. "It's not about race." Imani pressed her lips together, deciding not to respond to that yet. She wasn't going to waste her breath explaining to a jaded officer how unconscious bias worked. Instead, she addressed Sergeant Mills. "Sergeant, I want to file a formal complaint." This is a clear case of unlawful arrest, discrimination and misconduct, and there will be follow-up from my office." Mills nodded solemnly. "Understood. I'll begin the necessary paperwork immediately. And of course you're free to leave whenever you wish, Dr. Caldwell. However, I hope you'll allow us to do everything in our power to make this right." She took a moment to collect her thoughts. She had spent years championing police reform, well aware that some officers truly tried to serve their communities, while others abused their power. This was not a trivial matter. Her false arrest would make waves. If handled poorly, it could set back the trust-building efforts between law enforcement and communities of color. On the other hand, sweeping this under the rug would be a betrayal of the very principles she stood for. "Sergeant Mills, I appreciate your willingness to address this," she said, standing up. "But you need to understand something. This is not just a personal grievance. I've been advocating for systematic changes. Incidents like these are the exact reason I was appointed Chief Prosecutor, focusing on accountability. It's time we stop repeating the same excuses." She gave Rick a final, piercing stare. "As for you, Officer Devlin, I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again very soon." Then she swept out of the office, retrieving her briefcase from a stunned Officer Alvarez in the hallway. Alvarez stammered an apology, but Imani barely acknowledged it, disappearing down the corridor with a resolute stride. A hush fell over the station as she passed. Officers stared, recognizing the high-profile figure they had inadvertently wronged. When the door finally closed behind her, Rick exhaled shakily. Mills said nothing for a long moment, just stared at Rick with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Finally, Mills rubbed his temples. "You've stepped in it, Devlin. Big time." Rick tried to maintain a shred of defiance, but fear gnawed at his insides. He saw his career flash before his eyes. "I was just doing my job," he repeated weakly, though it was clear to both men that an apology or contrition might be his only hope of salvaging the mess. Imani's drive to the Daily Center was a blur of racing thoughts. She could have demanded that the station immediately phone the mayor's office, or the governor, or even the Department of Justice. She had that clout. But this wasn't about flexing power for the sake of vanity. It was about exposing a deeper, more pervasive problem within law enforcement. For the rest of the day, she moved through her scheduled meetings in a haze. Whenever her colleagues asked if she was all right, she offered a curt nod, reluctant to discuss the humiliation she had endured. Word, however, spread quickly. By late afternoon, her assistant informed her that several local news outlets had already caught wind of a rumor. The state's chief prosecutor was temporarily detained by the Chicago Police Department. Initially, Imani considered staying silent until she had all the facts. But the phone calls from her office's PR team and the governor's liaison were relentless. In an era of 24-hour news, the story would break with or without her input. So she scheduled a brief press statement for the following morning, enough time to collect herself and ensure the legal ramifications were clearly outlined. Meanwhile, at the district station, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Alvarez was called into the captain's office to provide a statement. She told the truth. Rick had refused to verify Dr. Caldwell's ID and insisted on the arrest without probable cause. Her stomach churned as she recounted the details. She respected Rick's experience, but she couldn't lie to cover for him. Afterward, she sat alone in the break room, sipping on stale coffee, wondering if she'd done the right thing. She felt a swirl of guilt, relief, and apprehension for what might come next. Rick endured an even more grueling debrief with internal affairs. By the time he stepped out of the interview room, he felt drained. He sank into a chair by his desk, rubbing the back of his neck. Some of his colleagues shot him sympathetic looks, while others avoided him entirely, not wanting to be tainted by association. The rumor mill suggested that top brass at CPD headquarters was furious, as was the mayor's office. The fiasco threatened to overshadow the department's recent push to improve community relations. At home that night, Rick sat in silence, the TV remote untouched, the overhead light flickering. He could barely eat. Old memories came flooding back, times he'd prided himself on cleaning up the streets, times he thought being tough on petty suspects was the only way to maintain order. Now, the lines between righteous policing and prejudice blurred uncomfortably. A small voice in his mind whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, he had let his biases override better judgment. Still, anger stirred in his chest. He didn't like feeling cornered. He told himself, "I've done everything by the book, most of my career. No way I'm the villain here." But the seeds of doubt had been planted. The following morning, a swarm of reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers crowded the steps of the Cook County building. Imani stood at a wooden podium, flanked by members of her staff and local civil rights leaders. News vans from ABC 7, CBS 2, NBC 5, and even national outlets like CNN had parked haphazardly along the streets, satellite dishes raised like metallic sunflowers. Social media was abuzz with hashtags like #wrongful-arrest, #justice for Imani, and #police accountability. Imani began her statement with calm precision. "Good morning, my name is Dr. Imani Caldwell, and I serve as the state's chief prosecutor for Illinois." She paused, letting the cameras snap away. "Yesterday, I was wrongfully detained by an officer of the Chicago Police Department. I was handcuffed and accused of theft solely on the word of a stranger, without due process or verification of my clear credentials. This is not an isolated incident. It reflects a systemic issue that many black and brown citizens face daily, being perceived as criminals first, rather than individuals with rights." She went on to clarify that she would be filing an official complaint against Officer Richard Devlin, but emphasized that her intention was not to single out one officer as a scapegoat. "This must be a turning point," she declared, "for genuine structural change. If this can happen to me, a public figure with extensive legal authority, imagine what happens to countless others who don't have the privilege of an official title or the platform to speak out." The crowd murmured, cameras flashed, and some people applauded. In the front row, activists from local chapters of the NAACP and the ACLU nodded in support. She concluded, "I will be working closely with the mayor's office, the governor, and CPD leadership to investigate this incident thoroughly and to implement further reforms. Every citizen, regardless of race, deserves the same fair treatment under the law." Her speech triggered a wave of media commentary. Throughout the day, interview requests poured in. Social media lit up with both support and vitriol, some praising her courage, others defending Officer Devlin's actions under the claim that cops have a hard job. By lunchtime, the story had made national headlines. For Rick, watching the press conference footage from the station's TV lounge was surreal. He recognized the platform Dr. Caldwell wielded. He could practically feel the ground shifting beneath him, threatening to swallow his career whole. Still, a part of him burned with anger. "She's using this to grandstand," he muttered to Alvarez, who silently walked away, unwilling to engage in a debate. That afternoon, Rick's direct supervisor called him in. Paperwork was thrust into his hands, a suspension notice pending the outcome of an internal investigation. Rick slammed his fist on the desk, but it changed nothing. He was told to turn in his badge and service weapon. Moments later, he found himself leaving the station with a cardboard box of his belongings, ignoring the stares of fellow officers. His career seemed to be unraveling, and he had no one to blame but himself, or so the department leadership insisted. Imani's team wasted no time in filing the necessary legal motions. The seriousness of the complaint threatened to rock Chicago's law enforcement community. Yet behind the scenes, there were those who saw Rick's wrongful arrest not just as an isolated incident, but as a potential wedge to weaken Imani's influence in reform. Enter Alderman Brian Healy, a seasoned politician with deep ties to the police union and certain businesses that preferred the status quo. He had never liked Imani's brand of reform. Rumors suggested Healy had been under investigation by her office for misappropriation of community development funds, funds that mysteriously ended up benefiting his campaign donors. Now, with the public drama swirling around her arrest, he saw an opportunity to undermine her standing. In backroom conversations, Healy reached out to Officer Devlin's union representative. "We can spin this," he told them over the phone. "Devlin was doing his job. We leak certain details, question her credibility, enough to muddy the waters." The union rep was cautious, but intrigued. They knew public sympathy was currently with Imani, but policing was complicated. Often, if you repeated a narrative about how dangerous the streets were, how ambiguous circumstances could be, you could drum up enough doubt to protect an officer from severe disciplinary action. Meanwhile, Imani pressed forward with the official complaint, focusing on the bigger picture. Indefinite suspension or termination for Rick Devlin could be used as a precedent. She wanted to show that no officer was above accountability, but behind her public stance lay personal turmoil. She had nightmares about the handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists, triggering memories from her childhood when her father, a civil rights lawyer, was once wrongly detained in a protest. She also worried that her focus on this case might overshadow her myriad responsibilities, including a critical upcoming trial related to police brutality. While the city reeled, Rick found himself at home, stewing in resentment and shame. He spent his days scrolling through online news articles, devouring every twist in the coverage. A barrage of hateful messages filled his social media accounts, some calling him a racist, others praising him for standing up to a corrupt system. He tried to drown it all out, but it gnawed at him. A letter from the Fraternal Order of Police arrived, offering legal counsel. Emboldened by the letter, Rick decided to fight back. He met with an attorney affiliated with the police union who suggested a countersuit for defamation. "We can argue that Dr. Caldwell defamed you by calling your actions discriminatory without proof," the lawyer proposed, leaning back in his leather office chair, "and we can claim emotional distress." Rick wasn't entirely convinced, but desperation led him to nod. "I'll do whatever it takes," he murmured. Thus, the stage was set for a legal showdown, with undercurrents of corruption, racism, and political ambition swirling in the background. Both sides prepared for what the media was now calling the trial within the system. Although Rick hadn't been criminally charged for wrongful arrest, the official complaint by Dr. Caldwell had significant weight. The hearing before the Chicago Police Board was scheduled for the following month, and the entire city braced for fireworks. If the police board ruled against Rick, it could lead to his termination and even open the door for further civil or criminal inquiries into his conduct. In the meantime, Rick's countersuit for defamation against Imani was also inching forward in the courts, an audacious move that many legal analysts scoffed at, but which was enough to muddy the public discourse. The question on everyone's lips: would Dr. Caldwell be forced to testify? Would she hold up under cross-examination? For Imani, balancing her roles as both a public official and a litigant was tricky. She delegated some responsibilities to her deputies, but insisted on personally overseeing the complaint. Tired lines etched her face as she stayed up late, drafting arguments. She also had to coordinate with the mayor's office, which worried about the potential PR fallout. Meanwhile, Rick spent hours with his union-appointed lawyer, Alan Harris, shaping their defense. The angle was straightforward. Rick would claim that the arrest was a legitimate misunderstanding, that he was responding to a potential theft complaint, and that Dr. Caldwell escalated the situation by refusing to comply. He would also lean heavily on the idea that the environment of 47th Street was known for crime, leading him to err on the side of caution. Behind closed doors, Alan Harris bluntly told Rick, "We might not win a moral victory, but we can aim for a technical victory. We can cast doubt, challenge procedure. But I need you to keep your composure. No outbursts about thugs or anything that looks racially charged." Rick bristled at the insinuation that he harbored racist sentiments, but he said nothing, focusing on the slim hope of preserving his badge. Then came the day that changed everything. Inside the Cook County Courthouse at 26th and California, spectators and reporters packed the public gallery. Tension hung in the air, thick as August humidity. At the front of the wood-paneled courtroom, the presiding judge, Honorable Michelle Rogers, sat poised, scanning the crowd with keen eyes. She was known for her calm but no-nonsense demeanor. Because Rick's countersuit for defamation had ironically landed in the system faster than the police board hearing, today's session concerned preliminary motions related to that civil action. Dr. Caldwell sat at the plaintiff's table, though in this bizarre twist, she was actually the defendant to Rick's defamation claim. Next to her was her lead counsel, Naomi Frazier, an accomplished civil rights attorney who had partnered with the state's attorney's office before. At the opposing table sat Rick and his lawyer, Alan Harris. Rick tried to ignore the cameras behind him, focusing instead on the mahogany table's glossy surface. His heart pounded, a dull ache forming at his temples. Judge Rogers began, "We're here to address Mr. Devlin's claim of defamation against Dr. Caldwell Dalmister. Harris, you filed a motion for a temporary injunction preventing Dr. Caldwell from publicly describing Mr. Devlin's conduct as racially motivated. The reasoning, as I understand, is that such statements are harming your client's reputation and mental well-being." "Yes, Your Honor," Harris said, standing and buttoning his suit jacket. "Officer Devlin has been subject to extreme harassment and threats. We argue that Dr. Caldwell's public assertion of racism is an unfounded opinion that is irreparably damaging my client's standing in the community." A ripple of disquiet moved through the courtroom. Imani maintained a calm facade, but her fist clenched under the table. Naomi Frazier rose to respond. "Your Honor, the plaintiff seeks to muzzle my client from stating her experiences and her well-grounded belief that bias, including racial bias, played a role in her wrongful arrest. We argue this is not defamation, but a legitimate observation of systemic issues, backed by data and by the very nature of the events on 47th Street. Before Harris could counter, Judge Rogers raised a hand. "Thank you, Miss Frazier. I've reviewed the preliminary filings. The concept of racial bias is indeed complex. We must balance First Amendment rights with the potential for reputational harm. However, I caution both sides. This preliminary hearing is not a trial on the merits of the arrest itself or the deeper systemic issues. Our focus is narrow, dealing only with whether Dr. Caldwell's statements meet the threshold for defamation under Illinois law." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze flicking from Harris to Frazier. "Accordingly, I'm inclined to deny the motion for a temporary injunction. Dr. Caldwell has the right to express her perspective on her own arrest. Unless the plaintiff can show a direct, provable falsehood beyond an opinion, there is no defamation. Mr. Harris, do you have any additional points of law to present?" Harris hesitated. "We request limited discovery," regarding Dr. Caldwell's internal communications to see if she knowingly made false statements about Officer Devlin's alleged racism. Naomi immediately protested. "That request is a fishing expedition, Your Honor." The judge frowned. "I'll allow a narrowly tailored discovery request, but I will not permit this to become a broad inquiry into the state's attorney's office. Keep it focused on Dr. Caldwell's public statements regarding Officer Devlin." "Understood." Both sides nodded. With that, the gavel came down, concluding the day's session. A swirl of chatter erupted as the spectators filed out, reporters jostling for quotes. Rick kept his head down, feeling the sting of the judge's implicit skepticism about his defamation claims. Outside the courthouse, Imani made a brief statement to the press. "We remain steadfast that our position is grounded in truth, and we believe the court will ultimately affirm that." That moment marked a turning point. Rick's bold countersuit was not outright dismissed, but it wasn't strengthened either. Supporters of Imani claimed the day a victory, while pro-police factions grumbled about judicial bias. The stage was now set for an even bigger showdown. The official hearing on Imani's complaint against Rick and the CPD, a hearing that would put the entire city's attention on the question of race, policing, and accountability. As Chicago buzzed with opinions, radio talk shows debating the arrest, social media ablaze with arguments, both Rick and Imani found themselves in introspective states. Imani juggled new cases and her staff's concerns, but late at night she replayed the incident on 47th Street in her mind, each time feeling the cold metal of those handcuffs. She was no stranger to confrontation, but this incident struck a personal chord. If she, with all her clout, could be so easily profiled and manhandled, how many others had suffered worse fates? Rick, on the other hand, drank. He tried to calm his nerves with whiskey, alone in his small apartment, the smell of old takeout containers permeating the stale air. He thought about the man in the hoodie, the accusations that sparked the arrest. Why hadn't he questioned the man's story more thoroughly? Why had he been so quick to cuff Imani? A memory crept from the depths of his mind. A few years back, he had responded to a domestic violence call. A woman had insisted that her partner was threatening her, but Rick doubted her. He believed the man, who was calm and collected when officers arrived. Days later, the woman was hospitalized from a severe beating. That guilt had lingered. Had Rick overcorrected this time, deciding that any woman who might be in conflict with a man must be at fault? Or had it been an unconscious prejudice at play? Despite his internal struggles, Rick was not ready to concede defeat. He had some supporters, fellow officers, certain community members who believed that the city's top prosecutor was too anti-cop, even a few old friends who believed Rick to be a decent man caught in a political game. They urged him to keep fighting, and so he complied, though the cost to his psyche grew with each passing day. Finally, the day arrived for the Chicago Police Board hearing on Rick's misconduct case, arguably the main event. The hearing took place in a large assembly room in police headquarters, with a dais of board members overseeing the proceedings. The room was structured more formally than a typical meeting, given the high-profile nature of the case. The prosecution side, representing the complaint, was led by a veteran attorney named Constance Rollins, who specialized in police accountability issues. Though Imani held the position of complainant, she didn't present the case herself to avoid a conflict of interest. Instead, she testified as a witness to her own arrest. Rick had a union lawyer by his side, along with some minimal support from the FOP Fraternal Order of Police, although they were cautious about being too publicly aligned with him. Camera crews were not allowed inside, but a throng of journalists waited outside the building. Community members and activists filled the seats, some wearing T-shirts with slogans like "Stop Racial Profiling" or "Support Our Police," as the city's divide manifested in fashion choices. Testimony from Imani Caldwell When Imani took the stand, the room hushed. She recounted, in meticulous detail, the events on 47th Street, how she provided her ID, how Rick refused to verify it, and how he handcuffed her without probable cause. She spoke with a measured tone, yet a palpable undercurrent of controlled anger. More than once she emphasized, had the officer simply followed procedure, radioed in my ID number, none of this would have happened. Cross-examination by Rick's lawyer was pointed. Dr. Caldwell, isn't it true you refused to cooperate with Officer Devlin's orders? She refused to be rattled. I complied with every lawful order. I provided identification, but the officer never took the step to confirm it. That is not a lack of cooperation. That is an officer ignoring available information. Testimony from Officer Devlin later. Rick took the stand. He wore his uniform, though he was still suspended, as if to remind the board of his role and service. He detailed his perspective, the phone call from dispatch, the man's accusation of theft, and how he believed the suspect Imani might be armed when she reached into her briefcase. He insisted it was a case of unfortunate misunderstanding, not misconduct or racism. Constance Rollins, for the prosecution, delivered her questions with scalpel-like precision. Officer Devlin, you claim Dr. Caldwell might have been armed. Did she make any gestures that suggested holding a weapon? Rick hesitated. She reached in quickly. I didn't know what she was grabbing. I had to err on the side of caution. So your standard protocol is to ignore an official government ID and jump straight to handcuffs. No, but you chose to do so in this case. Why? Constance's voice was stern. Rick's mouth felt dry. I was concerned for officer safety, he repeated, though it sounded hollow. The hoodie man in a twist. Constance revealed that they had tracked down the man in the hoodie, whose name was James Parker. Parker was a known petty thief with multiple prior arrests for fraud. He had submitted a statement saying he was the one who attempted to harass Dr. Caldwell. He even admitted that his accusation of theft was false, made in the heat of the moment. That hammered another nail into Rick's coffin. Not only did he fail to verify Imani's ID, he gave more credence to an unreliable individual's word. Impact statements, Officer Alvarez testified, her voice trembling as she recounted her version of events. She confirmed that Dr. Caldwell's ID looked official, but Rick dismissed it. He told me he had it under control, she said, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. So I stepped back. Community members and civil rights advocates also provided statements, citing a history of wrongful arrests in neighborhoods like Bronzeville, Englewood, and North Lawndale. Some credited recent improvements in CPD policies, while others insisted the system was still broken. After days of testimony, the police board convened in private to deliberate. The tension in the city was palpable. Talk radio, barbershops, coffee shops, all buzzed with speculation. Would Rick be fired? Would the board protect its own? At last, the board reconvened for the decision. The room was packed once again. Cameras flashed outside. Anxious murmurs filled the corridor. Rick, dressed in a plain suit now, sat at the front, shoulders hunched. Imani stood near the back, exuding a composed yet stern presence. The board's chairperson, a stern woman named Felicia Grant, delivered the ruling. Having reviewed the evidence, we find that Officer Devlin acted in gross violation of protocol by failing to verify the complainant's identification, by effecting an arrest without probable cause, and by demonstrating conduct unbecoming of an officer of the ship. A pause drew out, the entire room hanging on every word. As such, Officer Devlin is hereby terminated from the Chicago Police Department, effective immediately. Further, we are recommending that the Illinois State's Attorney's Office review his actions for any potential criminal or civil liabilities related to wrongful arrest. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the scattered gasps of Rick's supporters. Some spectators applauded. Rick's face drained of color. His career was over. The FOP reps shuffled their feet, avoiding his gaze. Inside, Rick felt a mixture of rage, betrayal, and shame. He had never imagined this outcome. He had spent most of his adult life in uniform, and in one catastrophic incident, it all came crashing down. Imani watched, her emotions swirling. She took no pleasure in seeing a man lose his livelihood, but she felt vindicated. This was accountability, albeit a single instance. People in the crowd approached her, offering handshakes and thanks. News crews jostled for a statement, and she simply said, "Justice was done today, but our work continues." That evening, as Rick left the hearing room, he found a group of reporters thrusting microphones in his face. "Officer Devlin, any comment on the board's decision?" they asked. For a split second, he wanted to lash out, to blame Imani, the system, or the board. Instead, he bowed his head and pushed through the throng in silence. He walked to his car alone, ignoring the stares and whispers. His mind roiled with 1,000 thoughts, but one dominated, "What do I do now?" He had no plan, no fallback. The tension inside him, the sense of injustice he felt, battled with an aching guilt he could not fully articulate. Karma had finally struck. Rick was no longer a police officer, no longer protected by the badge or the uniform. The world felt cold and unforgiving, and as he drove away from the building that had once symbolized his career, he understood that the consequences of his hasty, biased actions had come home to roost. In the weeks that followed, life in Chicago went on, as it always does. The 47th Street corridor continued its slow rejuvenation, aided by small businesses and local initiatives. The conversation around police reform reached a crescendo, with the mayor's office and Imani's team drafting new policies to ensure swift ID verification procedures and better anti-bias training. Dr. Imani Caldwell continued her work, more determined than ever. She advocated for body-worn cameras to be mandatory in all precincts, revisited the budget allocations for community policing, and pushed for stronger accountability mechanisms. She also reconnected with the neighborhoods that felt most alienated, holding town halls where residents could speak candidly about their experiences. Her star rose, not just in Illinois, but nationally. The White House's Criminal Justice Commission asked for her input on federal reform measures. Meanwhile, Rick struggled to find a footing. He applied to private security firms, but his public termination from CPD cast a long shadow. He ended up working part-time for a distant relative's warehouse near the outskirts of the city, loading boxes onto trucks, a far cry from his days wearing the badge. He tried to keep his head down, but every so often, a co-worker would recognize him from the news. The hush that fell when they realized his identity was always the same, a blend of curiosity, pity, and judgment. In a final note of irony, Rick's defamation countersuit never made it past the preliminary stages. It was dismissed by the court on grounds of insufficient evidence to prove false statements. The judge's ruling curtly stated that describing an officer's actions as racially biased is a protected opinion based on an individual's interpretation of observed events. His lawyer parted ways with him soon after. The union gave him a small severance, but distanced itself, not wanting to further erode public trust. Rick was left with the bitter taste of having lost everything: his job, his reputation, and his sense of purpose. Sometimes he watched Dr. Caldwell on the nightly news, addressing reporters about the latest reform efforts. He felt a pang of regret, an acknowledgement that had he followed protocol, listened to his partner, and verified her ID, none of this would have happened. She would have been just another figure passing in and out of his life. Instead, he had set in motion events that turned him into a cautionary tale. One afternoon, as Rick sat at a diner, sipping weak coffee, he overheard some patrons discussing Dr. Caldwell. "She's the real deal," one said. "We need more like her." holding cops accountable. Another chimed in, "Yeah, if only the police had more sense, no one would be in this mess." Rick fumed internally, but he didn't speak up. He stared down at his mug, swirling the dregs of coffee. Hard karma, indeed. Outside, the wind blew over Lake Michigan, rattling the city's skyscrapers and rippling through the neighborhoods. Winter was coming, and with it a fresh start for some, a harsh reckoning for others. For Dr. Caldwell, the winter wind meant new battles, new initiatives, and unwavering purpose. For Rick Devlin, it meant solitude and reflection far from the reassuring camaraderie of the station or the clout of a uniform. Two sides of the same city's story, bound by one fateful morning on 47th Street, each forging ahead into an uncertain future. And there you have it, a story of mistaken identity, unchecked bias, and the relentless march of justice. The shocking moment when a cop realized he had arrested the state's chief prosecutor laid bare the cracks in a system meant to protect us all. From the tense standoff on a bustling Chicago street to the fiery courtroom where one man lost everything and one woman rose to reshape the law, each twist in this tale reminds us that one careless act can change countless lives. If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, intrigued by the behind-the-scenes struggles for truth and accountability, be sure to like this video, share it with friends who appreciate a powerful dramatic story, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another tale that peels back the layers of justice and injustice alike. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching.